Well, we're about to start another COP. We're going into COP 15, which is taking place in Montreal in Canada from the 7th to the 19th of December. And much like the climate COP, this COP is an opportunity for all global UN nations to come together to negotiate under the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, and in particular to look at halting and reversing the decline in biodiversity we've seen, particularly since 1970. Just coming into this COP, we've had reports coming out that we've lost 70% of our biodiversity globally since 1970. That's an absolutely astonishing figure. And this meeting is absolutely critical because it will be one of the key moments where nations really do need to start putting in that effort, that ambition to try and reverse biodiversity loss. If we don't do it this year, and this COP has already been delayed for 2 years because of COVID, then we really are starting to run out of time globally. So it's an absolutely fundamental meeting to trying to address the nature crisis that we're seeing globally and tie it to climate change as well, so that we're seeing action being taken on nature and climate together. And as I mentioned, as well as being delayed for 2 years because of COVID, this COP is happening in Canada, but it's actually being presided over. The presidency as China, and it was originally meant to take place in China, but because of the COVID restrictions there that are ongoing, they have moved it to Canada, but we'll be in an unusual situation where we're seeing the presidency hosting a conference, not in its own country. So that'll be interesting in itself to see how that plays out. The other really noticeable thing for this COP is the lack of global targets we now have. So the latest round of targets, the Aichi targets, ran out 2 years ago. And since then, we haven't had a set of global targets on biodiversity loss. So we're looking to make sure that this COP really reinstates those targets and ups ambition. Not a single one of the Aichi targets was met by 2020. So we're not in a very good state going into this COP. And when you look at the negotiating text as well, almost every sentence in all of the texts is square bracketed, which means there hasn't yet been agreement on what those targets and goals are going to be. So that's something we'll be paying very close attention to. Now, the UK delegation is obviously calling for high ambition at this COP, which is really welcome to see. But like COP27, really, we want to see that level of ambition, that implementation of action at home, as well as calling for other nations to do their bit. And again, the UK is not in a great state, and particularly the UK government has actually failed on its own statutory deadlines for a whole number of nature-related policies, including setting the Environment Act targets. That deadline was missed at the end of October. But also, we recently put out a list that had 14 separate nature-related policies, all of which the deadlines for setting those policies have been missed, despite those promises made to get those policies in place in 2022. Going into COP15 then, we want to see three things. The first is what everybody wants to see. It's a global, legally binding treaty to halt and reverse the decline in biodiversity by 2030. Given we've only got 8 years to do that, and we've seen the 70% reduction since 1970, that is a huge ask. But we know we are not going to survive the climate crisis, we're not going to address biodiversity loss without that global commitment, that global action. So it'll be really important to see that coming out of this meeting. The second, as I mentioned, is seeing the UK government really walking the talk on its own commitments, its own rhetoric on biodiversity loss, and really turning the tide on all these delays that we've seen to biodiversity legislation and biodiversity-related policies, particularly from the UK government and policies in England. And the third thing we want to see is that support coming through from UK government for other nations to help them to address biodiversity loss, to agree on finance, to agree on shared metrics, shared ways of measuring what's happening with nature globally, and looking at all of the framework and the underpinning evidence and support that needs to address that through bodies like the IUCN, but also the whole range of global networks that exist on nature. Really, it's time to harness those networks and make sure that they're supporting the action that we can all take on the ground to help to restore nature. So we'll be bringing you regular updates again from Montreal this time, from COP15. And we'll be looking to try and summarise what's coming out of the negotiations, and like COP27, try and summarise what's going on around the margins as well. And being on the ground in Montreal, hopefully we'll be able to see some of the work that's going on that isn't necessarily making the headlines. So we'll look forward to bringing you those updates, and we'll see you soon.